What if the world had fallen? What if in 1940 Hitler stood at the gates of London? What if in 1941 Nazi banners flew over Moscow? Was there a moment, a single decision, where history could have taken a different path? For a time, Nazi Germany was unstoppable. It crushed armies, toppled governments, and turned Europe into its battlefield. From the fjords of Norway to the sands of North Africa, from the Atlantic coast to the Russian steppes, Hitler's war machine devoured nations at a terrifying pace. The world teetered on the edge of a dark new order, one where democracy, freedom, and resistance were nearly extinguished. But how close did the Nazis really come to total domination? This is not just a story of battles and invasions. It is a story of near victories, of strategic gambles that almost succeeded, of political miscalculations, technological rivalries, and turning points so narrow that, had a single decision been different, the world we know today might not exist. This documentary will uncover the moments when Nazi Germany stood on the brink of victory, where history nearly turned in their favor, only to falter due to miscalculations, resistance, and shifting tides. Tonight, we dissect the war that almost was, and the world that nearly came to be. The road to war, the perfect storm. Aftermath of World War I. The First World War ended on November 11th, 1918, but its consequences extended far beyond the battlefield. Germany, once a powerful empire, was left in ruins, economically devastated, politically unstable, and socially fractured. Millions of soldiers returned home to a country that no longer resembled the one they had left. There were no victory parades, no sense of honor, only defeat and hardship. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, imposed severe penalties on Germany. It was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, a clause known as the War Guilt Clause. The treaty demanded massive reparations payments, territorial losses, and strict military restrictions. The German people viewed this as a national humiliation, a punishment that went beyond fairness, and instead sought to cripple their country. As the economic impact of the treaty set in, inflation soared. By the early 1920s, hyperinflation had rendered the German mark almost worthless. Ordinary people found themselves in dire circumstances. Lifelong savings evaporated overnight, businesses collapsed, and food became scarce. This economic desperation laid the groundwork for widespread disillusionment. At the same time, political instability plagued the country. The newly formed Weimar Republic struggled to govern effectively. Traditionalists, monarchists, communists, and nationalists all clashed in the streets, each faction believing they had the solution to Germany's problems. Assassinations, violent uprisings, and strikes became common. The democratic system seemed incapable of restoring stability, and many Germans began to believe that democracy itself was the problem. With the collapse of trust in traditional politics, radical ideologies took root. The political landscape was increasingly divided between the far left, represented by communists, and the far right, which sought a return to German strength through nationalism and militarization. Many Germans longed for a strong leader, someone who could restore order, rebuild the economy, and undo the perceived injustices of Versailles. During this period, Adolf Hitler began his political ascent. A former soldier, he had been deeply affected by Germany's defeat and came to believe in the idea that Germany had been stabbed in the back by its own politicians and the Jewish population. In 1920, he joined the German Workers' Party, which later became the National Socialist German Workers' Party, better known as the Nazi Party. Hitler's ability to deliver passionate, fiery speeches quickly drew attention. He spoke about restoring German pride, reversing the Treaty of Versailles, and purging the country of those he claimed had betrayed it. His rhetoric resonated with many Germans who felt abandoned by their government and humiliated by foreign powers. In 1923, Hitler attempted to seize power in what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch. Inspired by Benito Mussolini's successful march on Rome, he and his supporters tried to overthrow the Bavarian government. However, the coup failed, and Hitler was arrested. While many saw this as the end of his political career, it instead became a turning point. During his time in prison, Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, My Struggle, a book that outlined his ideology and vision for Germany's future. In it, he detailed his plans for expansion, racial superiority, and the destruction of perceived enemies. Though his ideas were extreme, they found an audience. By the time he was released, Germany's economic situation had worsened. The Great Depression of 1929 devastated the global economy, and Germany was hit especially hard. With unemployment rising and desperation growing, Hitler's promises of stability and national revival gained widespread appeal. The conditions were now in place for the rise of a totalitarian state. The political climate had shifted. The German people, tired of instability, were ready to embrace a leader who promised strength and action. Hitler and the Nazi Party stood at the threshold of power. Germany had not yet become the Nazi war machine, but the foundation had been laid. The perfect storm was forming, and soon it would engulf the world. The path to power. By the early 1930s, Germany was on the verge of collapse. The Great Depression had left millions unemployed. The democratic government was paralyzed by infighting, and the people were desperate for stability. The Nazis, once a fringe group, had grown into a powerful movement by exploiting public frustration. Adolf Hitler, through a combination of fiery speeches, propaganda, and strategic alliances, positioned himself as Germany's savior. In 1933, he was appointed chancellor, but he had no intention of simply governing. He intended to rule. Within months, the Reichstag fire provided the perfect pretext for crushing opposition. Civil liberties were suspended, political enemies were imprisoned, and the Nazi regime tightened its grip on power. By 1934, with the death of President Hindenburg, Hitler combined the roles of chancellor and president, declaring himself Führer. Germany was no longer a democracy, it was a dictatorship. Hitler had achieved total power, but he wasn't satisfied. He had bigger plans. Plans that would test the resolve of the world. The first moves, reoccupation of the Rhineland, 1936. The Treaty of Versailles had forbidden Germany from militarizing the Rhineland, a critical region bordering France. But Hitler saw an opportunity to defy the treaty and test the will of Britain and France. In March 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland. It was a bold move, but Hitler knew the Allies were reluctant to confront him. France had the military strength to respond, but without British support, it hesitated. Britain, hoping to avoid another war, remained passive. Had France intervened, Hitler's forces, unprepared for war, would have had no choice but to retreat. But no action was taken. The world had given Hitler his first victory without firing a single shot. Hitler had learned a valuable lesson. Boldness would be rewarded. Now he would push even further. The Anschluss, the union with Austria, 1938. Germany and Austria shared deep cultural and historical ties, but the Treaty of Versailles had prohibited their unification. Hitler, an Austrian by birth, had always dreamed of bringing the two nations together under his rule. In early 1938, he pressured Austria's chancellor to accept Nazi influence. When resistance emerged, Hitler played his usual hand: threats, propaganda, and internal subversion. In March 1938, German troops entered Austria, this time met with cheers rather than resistance. The Anschluss was complete. Austria was now part of Nazi Germany. The world once again did nothing. Hitler had expanded Germany's borders without a single battle. With two successful gambles behind him, Hitler now turned his eyes toward Czechoslovakia. This time, the world would watch more closely. But would they act? The Sudetenland crisis in the Munich Agreement, 1938. The next step in Hitler's expansion was the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a large German-speaking population. Using propaganda, he fueled tensions, claiming that ethnic Germans were being mistreated and that Germany had a duty to protect them. Czechoslovakia was a strong nation with formidable defenses, and it had alliances with Britain and France. War seemed inevitable, but instead of standing firm, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain pursued appeasement. In September 1938, the Munich Agreement was signed, handing the Sudetenland to Germany in exchange for Hitler's promise of peace. Chamberlain famously declared he had secured peace for our time. But Hitler had no intention of stopping. The Munich Agreement had only convinced him of one thing: Europe was unwilling to stop him. Hitler had played the world's leaders like a game of chess. But how long could he keep winning? The next move would push Europe to the brink of war. The illusion of peace. By 1938, Hitler had already defied the Treaty of Versailles multiple times, rearming Germany, remilitarizing the Rhineland, and annexing Austria. But his most audacious demand yet was for the Sudetenland, a heavily fortified region of Czechoslovakia with a large German-speaking population. Czechoslovakia was not defenseless. It had a modern army and strong alliances with Britain and France. If war broke out, Hitler would be facing a formidable enemy. But rather than preparing for battle, he turned to manipulation. Using Nazi propaganda, Hitler spread the narrative that Sudeten Germans were being oppressed by the Czechoslovak government. German newspapers ran fabricated stories of atrocities, and tensions escalated. As violence flared, Hitler positioned himself as the savior of his people. Britain and France, still haunted by the devastation of World War I, were desperate to avoid another conflict. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain believed Hitler could be reasoned with. And so, in September 1938, he flew to Germany to negotiate. What followed would become one of the most infamous moments in diplomatic history. What Chamberlain didn't know was that, while he was negotiating for peace, Hitler was already preparing for war. The Munich Agreement, a dangerous gamble. On September 30th, 1938, the Munich Agreement was signed. Britain and France agreed to Hitler's demands, forcing Czechoslovakia to surrender the Sudetenland without a fight. In return, Hitler promised he had no further territorial ambitions. As Chamberlain returned to Britain, he stood before cheering crowds and confidently declared, "I believe it is peace for our time." But inside Hitler's headquarters, the reaction was different. The Führer was enraged, not because he had been forced to compromise, but because he had expected a war. "I won't be satisfied with this," he reportedly told his inner circle. "It is too little." Hitler had bluffed, expecting resistance. Instead, he had been handed a major strategic victory with no cost. And now he was more convinced than ever that Britain and France would not stop him. Chamberlain had gambled on peace, but he had only bought Hitler more time. What would the price of appeasement be? The betrayal of Czechoslovakia. If Britain and France believed Hitler would stop with the Sudetenland, they were wrong. 6 months later, in March 1939, German forces marched into the rest of Czechoslovakia. There was no pretense this time. This was a blatant occupation. For the first time, the world saw the truth. Hitler wasn't just reclaiming lost German territory. He was expanding an empire. Britain and France had promised peace, but now their credibility was in ruins. There was no mistaking Hitler's ambitions anymore. Appeasement had failed. Now Hitler was ready for his next move, the invasion that would ignite World War II. The Nazi-Soviet pact, a pact of deception. By mid-1939, Europe was teetering on the edge of war. Britain and France had finally realized that appeasement had failed. and they issued warnings to Hitler. Any further aggression would mean war, but Hitler had already made his decision. Poland was next. There was just one problem. A war against Poland meant a possible two-front conflict, with Britain and France to the west and the Soviet Union to the east. Hitler needed to neutralize that threat before making his move. On August 23, 1939, the world was stunned by an unexpected announcement. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact. At first glance, it seemed like a diplomatic oddity. Two ideological enemies, Hitler and Stalin, agreeing to peace. But beneath the surface, the deal was far more sinister. What the world didn't know was that the pact contained a deadly secret, one that would divide Eastern Europe before the first shot of the war was even fired. The secret protocol, a carve-up of Europe. Buried within the Nazi-Soviet pact was a secret agreement. Hitler and Stalin had already decided how Eastern Europe would be divided. Poland would be split in half, Germany would take the west, the Soviet Union the east. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, were promised to Stalin. Finland was left vulnerable to Soviet invasion. Stalin, eager to regain former Russian territories, saw the pact as an opportunity. Hitler, on the other hand, now had the freedom to invade Poland without fear of Soviet interference. Neither side trusted the other, but for now, their interests aligned. The world, unaware of the secret terms, still believed war might be avoided. But in reality, the countdown to war had already begun. Hitler had set his invasion date. The world had just days left before everything changed. Final hours, a world on the brink. By late August 1939, German troops were massing on Poland's borders. War was inevitable, yet Hitler played a final deception. He wanted to justify the invasion with a fabricated excuse. On August 31st, Nazi operatives carried out Operation Himmler, a staged attack on a German radio station near the Polish border. Disguised as Polish soldiers, they broadcast a fake message calling for an uprising against Germany. Hitler now had his pretext. Just before dawn on September 1st, 1939, German tanks rolled across the Polish frontier. Bombs rained down on Warsaw. Poland fought bravely, but the Blitzkrieg lightning war was unlike anything the world had seen. Britain and France issued an ultimatum: withdraw or face war. Hitler ignored it. On September 3rd, 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The war Hitler had long prepared for had finally begun. But had he truly accounted for everything? Or had he just set in motion the downfall of his own empire? The invasion of Poland, a new kind of warfare in motion, the downfall of his own empire? At 4:45 a.m. on September 1st, 1939, the world changed forever. German artillery roared to life along the Polish border, and within moments the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was streaking across the sky. Bombs fell on Warsaw, railways, and key military positions, severing Poland's ability to coordinate a defense. This was no ordinary invasion. This was Blitzkrieg, lightning war. It was fast, ruthless, and unlike anything Europe had seen before. German panzers, tanks, and mechanized infantry smashed through Polish defenses with surgical precision. Instead of slow-moving trench warfare, like in World War I, Hitler's forces struck in coordinated waves. First, the Luftwaffe obliterated communication lines, airfields, and supply depots. 2. Then panzer divisions ripped through enemy lines, bypassing strong points and encircling Polish troops. 3. Finally, infantry swept in to finish the job, crushing any resistance. Within just 5 days, the Polish capital, Warsaw, was cut off. The Polish army fought bravely, but they were overwhelmed. Meanwhile, the world watched in horror. But Poland was not just fighting Germany. Another betrayal was about to seal its fate. Soviet stab in the back, September 17, 1939. As Polish forces desperately tried to hold their ground, a new enemy appeared on the horizon. On September 17, 1939, the Soviet Red Army poured across Poland's eastern border. It was the final blow. The Nazi-Soviet pact was now fully in motion. Poland, trapped between two superpowers, had no chance. The Polish government fled into exile. Soldiers who weren't captured or killed either went underground or escaped to fight another day. By October 6, 1939, Poland had ceased to exist as an independent nation. Britain and France, having declared war on Germany on September 3rd, did nothing to help their ally. There was no immediate invasion of Germany, no decisive military response. Instead, they remained behind their fortifications, hesitant to act. Hitler had gambled. He had expected Britain and France to hesitate, and he had been right. With Poland crushed in a matter of weeks, Hitler now turned his attention to the West. Could France and Britain stop him? Or would Blitzkrieg claim its next victims? A false sense of security. With Poland crushed, Europe braced for what was expected to be a long, grueling conflict. Britain and France, having declared war, prepared for a defensive struggle. The French military was confident in one thing above all: their seemingly impenetrable Maginot Line, a vast network of fortifications stretching along the German border. The Maginot Line had been designed to prevent another German invasion. It was heavily fortified with underground bunkers, artillery positions, and miles of reinforced concrete. French military planners believed it would force any German attack into Belgium, where Allied forces could stop them. And so, for months, there was nothing. This period, known as the Phony War, Drôle de Guerre, saw both sides largely inactive, as if waiting for the other to make the first move. But while Britain and France sat behind their defenses, Hitler was already planning something devastating. What the French didn't realize was that Hitler had no intention of attacking the Maginot Line directly. He had found another way in: the Ardennes, the back door to France. On May 10, 1940, Hitler launched Fall Gelb and Case Yellow, the invasion of the Low Countries in France. As expected, German forces struck Belgium and the Netherlands first. The Allies rushed forward, believing this was the main attack. But they had fallen into a trap. The real attack came through the Ardennes forest, a heavily wooded, hilly region on the French-Belgian border that French commanders believed was impassable for tanks. Because of this, it was lightly defended. Hitler's panzer divisions stormed through the Ardennes at breathtaking speed. By May 13th, they had crossed the Meuse River, and by May 15, the French front was shattered. German tanks were now racing toward the English Channel, cutting off thousands of Allied troops. The French army, one of the largest in the world, collapsed in just weeks. Paris was now within reach. Could the city hold out, or was France doomed? Paris falls, Hitler's triumph. By June 10, 1940, the French government had abandoned Paris. The city, once thought invincible, was left to fend for itself. 4 days later, on June 14th, German troops marched into the capital. The world watched in disbelief as Nazi banners were draped over the Eiffel Tower. France had fallen in just 6 weeks. The armistice was signed on June 22nd, in the very same railway carriage where Germany had surrendered in 1918. Hitler had orchestrated his revenge. With France defeated, only one major enemy remained: Britain. Would Hitler now achieve total domination of Europe, or was his greatest challenge still ahead? A desperate retreat. With France collapsing faster than anyone had imagined, the situation for the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, and their French allies became dire. By late May 1940, nearly 400,000 Allied troops were trapped along the northern coast of France, backed up against the sea. The Germans had moved with terrifying speed, slicing through the French defenses and encircling the Allied forces. The only way out was the port city of Dunkirk, but with German tanks closing in and the Luftwaffe controlling the skies, escape seemed impossible. The British High Command considered surrendering the entire force, an unthinkable disaster that would leave Britain defenseless. If the British Army was destroyed here, nothing would stop Hitler from invading the British Isles. And then, just as all seemed lost, something unexpected happened. Hitler gave an order that baffled even his own generals. Hitler's halt order, a fatal mistake? On May 24, 1940, with German tanks just 15 miles from Dunkirk, Hitler ordered them to stop. For 2 full days, the Panzers, unstoppable until now, sat idle. The reason remains one of history's greatest mysteries. Some believe Hitler wanted to spare his elite tank divisions for the coming battle against France. Others say he was listening to Hermann Goering, who promised the Luftwaffe alone could finish off the British. A few even speculate that Hitler hesitated, hoping Britain would negotiate peace instead of fighting on. Whatever the reason, those 2 days changed history. The British now had a window of opportunity, but could they really evacuate an entire army under enemy fire? Operation Dynamo, the unbelievable rescue. With German tanks held back, Britain launched Operation Dynamo, an evacuation effort like no other. From May 26 to June 4, 1940, a ragtag fleet of over 800 vessels, including naval destroyers, merchant ships, and even small civilian fishing boats, crossed the English Channel to Dunkirk. Soldiers waded into the sea, boarding anything that floated. The Luftwaffe bombed the beaches relentlessly, turning the evacuation into chaos. The Royal Air Force fought desperately to protect the escaping troops. By the end, over 338,000 men had been rescued. Winston Churchill called it a miracle. But despite the triumph, Britain had lost nearly all its heavy weapons and vehicles. They had escaped, but they were now vulnerable. With France defeated and Britain alone, Hitler prepared for his next move. Was the British Empire about to fall? Britain stands alone. The world watched in stunned silence. France had fallen. The British Army had barely escaped at Dunkirk. Most expected Britain to surrender or seek a peace deal, perhaps even Hitler himself. But instead of bowing, Britain prepared for a fight. Winston Churchill, now Prime Minister, delivered a speech that echoed across history. "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender." But words alone wouldn't be enough. Britain's survival now depended on a single battle, one fought not on land, but in the skies. And Hitler was about to unleash the full power of the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe's onslaught. In July 1940, Hitler ordered Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. But first, the Luftwaffe needed to destroy the Royal Air Force, RAF, and gain air superiority. At first, it seemed like Britain stood no chance. Germany had over 2,600 aircraft, many of them battle-tested from Poland and France. Britain had barely 700 frontline fighters. The Luftwaffe had already dominated Europe's skies. The first phase of the battle saw the Luftwaffe targeting British radar stations, airfields, and aircraft factories. The goal? Cripple the RAF before the real invasion began. For weeks, German bombers and fighters attacked relentlessly. British pilots, outnumbered and exhausted, fought desperately. Some flew multiple missions a day, pushing themselves to the brink. But then, Hitler made another critical mistake, one that would change the course of the war. The bombing of London, a fatal miscalculation. On August 24, 1940, a German bomber accidentally dropped bombs on London. Churchill retaliated by bombing Berlin. Furious, Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to shift its focus away from airfields and military targets, and instead bomb British cities. For the next 57 nights, London and other cities burned under the Blitz. Thousands of civilians died. But while British cities suffered, the RAF had time to recover. Damaged airfields were repaired. Aircraft production ramped up. Pilots were given the rest they needed to keep fighting, and then on September 15, 1940, in a final desperate push, the Luftwaffe launched its largest attack yet. Hundreds of bombers and fighters swarmed British airspace. They expected the RAF to be broken. Instead, British fighters tore through the German formations. The Luftwaffe suffered devastating losses. By October 31, 1940, Hitler abandoned the invasion of Britain. The RAF had held the line. The Nazi war machine had suffered its first true defeat, but Hitler was already looking east, toward an even greater gamble, the unfinished blueprint for conquest. By mid-1940, Hitler stood at the height of his power. France had fallen in just 6 weeks. The British Army had been driven from the continent, forced to abandon its tanks, artillery, and supplies on the beaches of Dunkirk. Britain was isolated, alone, and, so Hitler believed, on the verge of collapse. The next step in his grand strategy seemed obvious: a full-scale invasion of the British Isles. He called it Operation Sea Lion. With British defenses in tatters, many of Hitler's generals urged him to strike quickly. But the Führer hesitated. Why? Hitler knew that no invasion could succeed without total air superiority. And the skies over Britain were still contested. The Luftwaffe's strategy, breaking Britain's air defenses. Hitler's invasion plan hinged on the Luftwaffe. The Royal Navy controlled the seas, meaning a German landing force would be vulnerable unless the skies were dominated by German bombers and fighters. If the RAF could be wiped out, Britain would be defenseless. The strategy was clear. Phase 1. Destroy British radar stations, blinding the RAF. Phase 2. Bomb airfields and aircraft factories, crippling British fighter production. Phase 3. Lure the remaining RAF fighters into open battle and annihilate them. If the Luftwaffe succeeded, the next phase of Operation Sea Lion would begin. A massive amphibious invasion across the English Channel. The stakes, nothing less than the survival of Britain. But the RAF was not about to go down without a fight. The RAF's fight for survival, outnumbered and outgunned, the RAF had one crucial advantage: radar. For the first time in history, an air force could detect incoming enemy raids long before they arrived. With radar stations placed along the British coastline, RAF commanders could direct their limited number of fighters exactly where they were needed. Hurricanes and Spitfires scrambled within minutes of an attack. RAF pilots, often exhausted and flying multiple missions a day, refused to yield. Civilian volunteers worked tirelessly to repair damaged airfields and keep planes in the air. But even with radar, the odds were grim. In late August 1940, Luftwaffe bombers began targeting airfields directly. The RAF was bleeding, their pilots dying faster than they could be replaced. Britain was teetering on the edge. And then Hitler made yet another miscalculation, one that would cost him the battle: Britain's secret weapon, the invisible shield. The skies above Britain were filled with the deafening roar of German bombers and the desperate scramble of British fighters. The RAF was outnumbered, exhausted, and running out of time. But what the Luftwaffe didn't fully realize was that Britain possessed a game-changing advantage: a technology that would turn the tide of the battle before a single bullet was even fired. This was radar. Developed in the years leading up to the war, radar stations stretched across Britain's southern coast, silently watching the skies. Unlike any force before them, RAF commanders didn't need to guess where an attack would come from. They knew. Every incoming German squadron was detected long before it reached its target, giving British pilots precious time to prepare. With radar, Britain's defenses were no longer reactionary. They were preemptive. German formations were intercepted before they reached their objectives. The Luftwaffe struggled to gain the upper hand, not realizing they were fighting a battle Britain had already mapped out in advance. But technology alone wasn't enough. It needed bold leadership and relentless determination to withstand the Nazi onslaught. And no one embodied this defiance more than Winston Churchill. Churchill's defiance, the voice that refused to break. As bombs rained down over British cities and airfields, fear spread across the nation. Some within the government even whispered about seeking terms with Hitler. But for Winston Churchill, there was only one option: resistance at all costs. His speeches weren't just words. They were a rallying cry for an entire nation. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say this was their finest hour. Churchill knew that Britain's survival wasn't just about holding the skies, it was about breaking Hitler's will. If Britain stood firm, the war would not end in 1940. It would stretch into a war of attrition, one that Germany might not be prepared to fight. And as the weeks passed, something unexpected began to happen. The RAF, despite its losses, was still fighting. British cities, though bombed, were not surrendering. Hitler's dream of forcing Britain to its knees was slipping away. But in his frustration, Hitler made a fateful decision, one that would seal the fate of Operation Sea Lion. The turning point. No one expected by September 1940, Hitler was growing frustrated. The RAF had not been destroyed. The Luftwaffe had bombed airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories, but British fighters were still swarming the skies. Britain was not breaking. Then, a single event changed everything. One night, a German bomber accidentally veered off course and dropped its payload on London. It was not part of Hitler's strategy, yet it was about to alter the course of the war. Winston Churchill saw the attack as an opportunity. If Hitler was willing to target British civilians, then Britain would strike back. Days later, the RAF bombed Berlin. The German people had been told they were untouchable, that the war would never reach them. And yet, here it was, British bombs raining down on the German capital. Enraged, Hitler made a fateful decision, one that would cost him the Battle of Britain, a crucial mistake. The Blitz begins. Hitler, humiliated and furious, ordered a shift in strategy. Instead of continuing to attack RAF airfields and radar stations, the Luftwaffe was ordered to bomb British cities relentlessly. London, Coventry, Liverpool. Night after night, German bombers set the skies ablaze. Thousands died, buildings crumbled, firestorms turned night into day. But beneath the wreckage, something else was happening. The RAF, which had been on the brink of collapse, was given time to recover. Radar stations, spared from destruction, remained operational. British fighter production, once under siege, continued unhindered. In Hitler's mind, the terror bombing would break Britain's will. Instead, it gave Britain exactly what it needed to survive. And then the final blow came. Germany suffered a loss it could never recover from. The moment the tide turned, as the fires of London burned and German bombers filled the night sky, the fate of Britain hung by a thread. Hitler had thrown everything he had into the Blitz. believing that sheer terror would force the British to surrender. But beneath the ruins, a different story was unfolding, one that Germany never anticipated. Despite the relentless bombing, Britain refused to break, and as the RAF slowly regained its strength, the Luftwaffe began to suffer losses it could not afford. Then came a turning point. On September 15, 1940, a massive Luftwaffe assault was launched against London, one that Hitler believed would cripple the last of British resistance. But this time the British were ready. RAF fighters rose in full force, intercepting wave after wave of German bombers. By the end of the day, the Luftwaffe had lost nearly 60 aircraft, one of its worst defeats yet. For the first time, Hitler faced the reality that he might never conquer Britain. Germany's fatal miscalculations. With every passing week, Hitler's dream of an invasion was slipping further away. But why? 1. The Luftwaffe never gained air supremacy. The entire invasion plan depended on Germany controlling the skies. They failed. 2. The Royal Navy was still a threat. Even if German forces reached the English Channel, the Royal Navy was waiting to cut them down. 3. Britain's radar and intelligence network remained intact. The Luftwaffe was flying blind, while the British knew exactly where their enemy was at all times. 4. Hitler's strategic patience ran out. Instead of focusing on Britain, his attention was drifting elsewhere, to the east. And that decision would lead to a far greater mistake, one that would cost Hitler everything, the unbreakable spirit. As German bombers darkened the skies and cities burned, many believed Britain's resolve would finally shatter. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, families huddled in underground shelters, listening to the distant hum of approaching aircraft, bracing for the next wave of destruction. But surrender never came. Instead of breaking, the British people endured. Even as bombs tore through London, buses still ran, newspapers still printed, and the people still went to work. Factories kept producing fighter planes. The docks, even after being set ablaze, were cleared and repaired by morning. In the streets, an unlikely symbol of defiance emerged. Women, men, even children, painted over bombed-out shop signs with one simple phrase, "Business as usual." And as Britain refused to fall, Hitler made a fateful choice, one that would take the war in an entirely new direction. As Britain stood defiant, Hitler's patience began to wear thin. The Luftwaffe had failed to bring Britain to its knees, and Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion, had been indefinitely postponed. The war was not unfolding as he had envisioned. For the first time, the Nazi war machine had hit a wall. But Hitler never intended to wait. His true ambition had always lain elsewhere, in the East. To him, Britain was a distraction. The real prize was the vast, resource-rich land of the Soviet Union. Germany needed oil. Germany needed space. And Hitler needed a swift, decisive victory to prove that the Reich was unstoppable. But what if the invasion of the Soviet Union wasn't just a strategic shift, but a catastrophic mistake? By the autumn of 1940, Hitler had convinced himself that the Soviet Union could be conquered in mere months. Britain, he believed, was already a defeated enemy, one that could be dealt with later. Against the advice of some of his top generals, he ordered the preparations for Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history. His reasoning was simple. If the Soviet Union fell, Britain would have no choice but to surrender. The Reich would secure vast resources, ensuring Germany's dominance for generations. The war in Europe would be over by winter, but Hitler underestimated one thing. He was about to awaken a sleeping giant, and once that giant stood up, Germany's dream of total conquest would begin to collapse. By the summer of 1941, Hitler's frustration had turned into reckless ambition. Britain had survived the Blitz, and the war in the West had stalled. But in the East, Hitler saw an opportunity, a chance to crush the Soviet Union before the year was over. On June 22, 1941, over 3 million German soldiers, 3,500 tanks, and 2,700 aircraft stormed across the Soviet border in the largest invasion in human history. The world had never seen anything like it. At first, it seemed unstoppable. Soviet forces collapsed in the face of blitzkrieg tactics. Entire divisions were encircled, and cities fell like dominoes. By September, German forces were marching toward Moscow. Hitler was convinced victory was just weeks away. But what he failed to realize was that the Soviet Union was unlike any enemy he had ever faced. Hitler had planned for a short war. What he got was a war of attrition. He underestimated the Soviet will to resist. Cities like Leningrad and Stalingrad refused to fall, despite suffering unimaginable losses. The brutal Russian winter arrived sooner than expected. German tanks froze. Soldiers marched in summer uniforms, unprepared for temperatures that plummeted to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Soviet reinforcements poured in from the east. Entire armies that had been stationed near Japan were now rushing to the front. The Red Army was not beaten, it was adapting. And then, in December 1941, just as German forces approached Moscow, the Soviets launched a devastating counteroffensive. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht was pushed back. And this was only the beginning. Hitler had just made the biggest mistake of his life, one that would set Germany on a path to total defeat. The early morning of June 22, 1941, marked a turning point in history. Operation Barbarossa had begun. As the first rays of sunlight stretched across the eastern horizon, over 3 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, surged into Soviet territory. It was an invasion so vast, so meticulously planned, that even Hitler himself believed it would bring swift and total victory. The Red Army, caught off guard, crumbled in the face of the German blitzkrieg. Entire Soviet divisions were encircled and annihilated. In the first week alone, hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were taken prisoner, and vast stretches of land were seized. To Hitler and his generals, this seemed like proof that the Soviet Union was a hollow giant, ready to collapse. Berlin celebrated. The world watched in shock. But was this rapid success a sign of true victory, or the beginning of a deadly illusion? The Wehrmacht pushed forward relentlessly. By July, the Germans had advanced hundreds of miles. By September, they had reached the outskirts of Leningrad. By October, they were closing in on Moscow. It seemed as if nothing could stop them. But this was precisely where Hitler made his greatest miscalculation. The vastness of the Soviet Union meant German supply lines stretched dangerously thin. The Red Army, though battered, refused to surrender. They retreated, burned their own cities, and lured the Germans deeper into hostile territory. Winter was coming, and Hitler, blinded by early victories, had failed to prepare for a prolonged war. For the first time, the German war machine was beginning to show cracks, and those cracks would soon become fractures as an unforgiving winter and a relentless Soviet resistance turned the tide of war. A war unlike any other. As Nazi Germany plunged deeper into Soviet territory, the nature of the war changed. This was no longer a conventional battlefield of swift victories and clean conquests. It became a war of annihilation. Both sides fought with an intensity unseen in the West. For Hitler, the invasion of the Soviet Union was not just a military campaign, it was ideological. He saw the Slavic people as subhuman, the land as Germany's rightful territory, and the war as an opportunity for total extermination. Entire villages were burned to the ground. Soviet civilians were starved, shot, or sent to forced labor camps. The infamous Einsatzgruppen followed the Wehrmacht, carrying out mass executions of Jews, communists, and anyone deemed an enemy of the Reich. But Hitler wasn't the only one who embraced brutality. The Soviets, faced with the destruction of their homeland, fought back with equal ferocity. The Red Army implemented a scorched earth policy, destroying their own cities, burning their own fields, and leaving nothing for the advancing Germans. The deeper the Germans pushed, the harsher the resistance became. And as the war dragged on, new horrors would emerge, ones that would test the limits of human endurance. This was a war without rules. German soldiers quickly learned that the Soviet Union was not like France or Poland. Here, surrender was not an option. Soviet partisans waged a ruthless guerrilla war, sabotaging railways, ambushing convoys, and assassinating officers in the dead of night. Meanwhile, Stalin issued order number 227, not one step back. Any Soviet soldier who retreated without orders was to be shot on sight. Penal battalions, made up of criminals and deserters, were forced to charge directly at German lines, often unarmed. Cities like Stalingrad would become death traps, where every street, every building, every floor was a battlefield. This was not just war, it was survival. And as the Eastern Front descended further into chaos, one city would become the symbol of the Soviet will to resist: Leningrad. The noose tightens around Leningrad. As German forces thundered toward the heart of the Soviet Union, Hitler issued a chilling order. Leningrad must be erased from the map. The city, once the jewel of the Russian Empire, was now surrounded on all sides. In September 1941, Nazi and Finnish forces cut off all land routes. Supply lines were severed. 2.5 million people were trapped. Unlike other battles, Hitler had no plans for occupation. This was a siege of extermination. The Nazis would not storm the city, they would starve it to death. Winter came early. Temperatures plunged to -40 degrees Celsius. Food rations fell to less than 125 grams of bread per person. Bread made from sawdust. Dogs, cats, and rats vanished from the streets. People boiled leather belts for nourishment. But even as hunger and cold tightened their grip, Leningrad refused to surrender. And against all odds, the city would fight back in ways the Germans never expected. With no escape and no mercy from the enemy, Leningrad's only hope lay across the frozen waters of Lake Ladoga. It became known as the Road of Life, a perilous ice highway where Soviet trucks, under constant bombardment, carried food and supplies into the besieged city. Every night, drivers risked their lives, knowing the ice could crack beneath them. Every day, German artillery tried to shatter the route. Every trip meant the difference between life and death for thousands. By the time the siege was lifted in 1944, 872 days later, over 1 million people had died. But Leningrad never fell. And while one Soviet city endured the unthinkable, another braced for an even greater storm: Moscow. The battle for Moscow, Hitler's fatal stumble. With Leningrad locked in siege, Hitler turned his full attention to Moscow. In October 1941, Operation Typhoon began. The goal was clear: take the Soviet capital before winter set in. The Wehrmacht, bolstered by its previous successes, pushed forward with terrifying speed. Soviet defenses crumbled. Panic gripped Moscow. The Soviet government prepared to evacuate. Stalin did not. But just as the German advance seemed unstoppable, the first snowflakes fell. Nazi forces were completely unprepared for the brutal Russian winter. Their summer uniforms offered no protection from the freezing cold. Tanks froze in place. Guns jammed, fuel turned to sludge. Meanwhile, fresh Soviet reinforcements arrived, troops trained to fight in Arctic conditions. Then came the counterattack. On December 5th, 1941, the Red Army launched a devastating winter offensive. For the first time, the Germans were forced into full retreat. Hitler had failed to take Moscow, and for the first time, the world saw a terrifying truth. The Nazi war machine was not invincible. But Hitler's greatest gamble was still to come. In a city called Stalingrad, the resilience of Soviet forces in the harsh Russian winter. As the German war machine ground to a halt outside Moscow, it became clear that the Wehrmacht had underestimated two formidable enemies, Soviet resilience and the Russian winter. The Germans had arrived expecting a swift victory. They had not planned for a prolonged campaign in sub-zero temperatures. Their summer uniforms offered little protection from the relentless cold. Frostbite ravaged their ranks. Weapons jammed. Engines refused to start. But the Soviet forces, they had prepared. And as the blizzard swept across the battlefield, Stalin's next move would change the course of the war. On December 5th, 1941, as temperatures plunged to minus 40 degrees Celsius, the Soviet Union unleashed a devastating counteroffensive. Fresh divisions from Siberia, hardened by brutal winter conditions, swept into battle. German positions crumbled. Soldiers, frozen and exhausted, abandoned their posts. The Red Army, using skis and camouflaged winter gear, moved swiftly across the snow-covered battlefield. For the first time since the invasion began, the Germans were pushed back. Hitler had believed the Soviets would collapse under the Blitzkrieg. Instead, the invaders were now the ones retreating. But despite this setback, Hitler refused to accept defeat. His next move would lead to one of the most brutal battles in human history, Stalingrad. As the snow-covered battlefields of Moscow and Leningrad drained the strength of the Wehrmacht, Hitler faced an unsettling reality. His vision of a swift conquest of the Soviet Union had turned into a nightmare. The Nazi war machine, once seen as unstoppable, was now struggling against an enemy it had deeply underestimated. But what Hitler failed to realize was that the Soviet Union had one key advantage he could never match: its sheer size and industrial might. When the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Hitler believed that the Red Army would collapse within a matter of months. What he failed to anticipate was the relentless scale of Soviet manpower. Despite catastrophic losses in the early months, the Soviets continued to raise new armies at an astonishing rate. By the end of 1941, over 8 million Soviet soldiers had been mobilized. Even as entire divisions were annihilated, more recruits were being trained and sent into battle. For every German soldier who fell, another wave of Soviet troops was ready to take their place. But manpower was only part of the story. The Soviet Union also had an industrial strategy that Hitler never accounted for. As German forces advanced deep into Soviet territory, entire factories vanished overnight. From 1941 to 1942, over 1,500 factories were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and relocated thousands of miles east, beyond the reach of the German Luftwaffe. Cities like Sverdlovsk, Chelyabinsk, and Magnitogorsk became the new industrial heart of the Soviet war effort, producing tanks, artillery, and aircraft at an unprecedented pace. While the Germans struggled to replace their losses, Soviet factories were churning out T-34 tanks faster than the Germans could destroy them. Hitler had envisioned a war of lightning speed. Instead, he found himself locked in a war of attrition, one he could not win. But despite these mounting challenges, Hitler still believed he could turn the tide. His obsession with a single city, Stalingrad, would seal the fate of the Eastern Front. As Hitler's forces pushed deeper into Soviet territory, One city became the symbol of Nazi ambition, Stalingrad. Named after the Soviet leader himself, it was more than just a strategic target. It was a battle of ideology, a test of willpower. Hitler was obsessed with taking the city. Stalin was just as determined to defend it. But Stalin's defense of Stalingrad would not rely on sheer numbers alone. It would be built on ruthless, unyielding strategy. The not one step back order, Stalin's harshest command. In July 1942, as German forces advanced toward Stalingrad, Stalin issued Order Number 227, a command that would define the battle. Not one step back. Soviet soldiers were ordered to fight to the last man. Retreat was forbidden. Anyone caught fleeing would be shot by their own commanders. Blocking detachments were stationed behind the front lines, tasked with executing any Soviet soldier who attempted to withdraw. This brutal method created a terrifying resolve among Soviet troops. Either they held their ground or they died trying. But Stalin's most ingenious strategy would not come from brute force. It would come from turning the city itself into a deadly trap. The German army, trained for fast-moving blitzkrieg warfare, was now forced into brutal street-to-street combat. Stalin ordered his forces to engage the Germans at point-blank range, where their superior air support and artillery became useless. Factories, apartment blocks, and sewers turned into makeshift fortresses. Soviet snipers, hidden in the rubble, picked off German officers one by one. The Volga River became a lifeline. Despite constant German bombardment, Soviet reinforcements continued to arrive under the cover of darkness. Hitler had promised his generals that Stalingrad would fall in weeks. Instead, his army was being swallowed whole, trapped in a nightmare of never-ending resistance. But Stalin's most devastating counterattack was yet to come, one that would shatter Hitler's dreams of conquering the East. As the brutal winter set in and the ruins of Stalingrad swallowed Hitler's best troops, another harsh reality was sinking in. The Nazi war machine was stretched to its absolute limits. For years, Hitler had envisioned a swift, calculated war, with Germany's industries supplying his armies with everything they needed to sustain their momentum. But now the sheer scale of the conflict was exposing the fatal cracks in his strategy. And yet, the worst was still to come. Because while the Eastern Front drained his forces, another deadly threat was rising in the West. When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa in 1941, he gambled everything on a rapid Soviet collapse. His entire military strategy relied on quick, decisive victories. Prolonged war was never part of the plan. But as months dragged into years, the strain of fighting on two massive fronts was becoming unbearable. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, was being outproduced and outgunned. With aircraft factories bombed by Allied forces in the West, Germany struggled to replace lost planes. The Wehrmacht, once considered the most disciplined and mechanized army in the world, was now fighting a war of attrition with outdated equipment. Many German divisions on the Eastern Front were still using horses for transport, while Soviet T-34 tanks rolled off assembly lines at an unstoppable rate. Oil became the Achilles heel. Hitler's armies were starved for fuel, forcing desperate offensives toward oil-rich regions like the Caucasus, only to be halted and pushed back. Every bullet, every tank, every bomb had to be split between two distant, grueling battlefields, one against the Soviets in the East, the other against the growing force of the Allies in the West. But as the Soviets tightened their grip in the East, Hitler was about to face a new, unrelenting enemy from across the sea. The invasion of Normandy was on the horizon. As the Eastern Front consumed German resources and the Western Allies prepared their counterstrike, another battleground was shaping the fate of the war. one that Hitler never fully committed to. The scorching deserts of North Africa and the vast waters of the Mediterranean held a key strategic advantage, one that could have changed the course of history. If Germany had seized full control of this region, it would have cut off Britain's vital supply lines, threatened the Middle East's oil reserves, and opened a gateway to striking the Soviet Union from the south. But that didn't happen. Why? The answer lies in Hitler's indecision and the rise of a brilliant general known as the Desert Fox. In early 1941, as the war in Europe raged on, Hitler sent one of his most skilled commanders, Erwin Rommel, to North Africa. With his lightning-fast tactics and ability to outmaneuver larger forces, Rommel quickly earned his legendary nickname, the Desert Fox. His Africa Corps crushed British defenses and pushed deep into Egypt, threatening the Suez Canal. With a full-scale German commitment, North Africa could have become the springboard for an invasion of the Middle East and beyond. But there was one problem. Hitler never saw North Africa as a priority, and that mistake would cost him dearly. Rommel pleaded for reinforcements, warning that without more tanks, fuel, and men, his advance would collapse. But Hitler was already fixated on the Eastern Front, diverting critical resources away from North Africa. The British, under General Bernard Montgomery, launched a devastating counterattack at El Alamein. With supply lines stretched too thin, Rommel's forces were outgunned and pushed into retreat. By 1943, the Axis powers had lost North Africa entirely. Instead of becoming a German stronghold, the region became the Allies' launchpad for their next move, invading Italy. And as the Allies marched into Italy, Hitler would soon face the ultimate betrayal from within his own ranks. As the battle for North Africa escalated, one name struck both fear and admiration across the battlefield: Erwin Rommel. His Africa Corps, a force that had started as a mere reinforcement for struggling Italian divisions, had turned into a symbol of German tactical brilliance. With swift strikes and unpredictable maneuvers, Rommel outclassed his opponents time and time again. But no matter how brilliant a commander might be, even the greatest tactician cannot win a war without supplies. And that was Rommel's greatest disadvantage, one that would ultimately seal his fate in the desert. Rommel's strategies in the open desert were unlike anything the British had seen before. Using rapid attacks, feints, and deep penetration tactics, he repeatedly outmaneuvered larger, better-equipped forces. In early 1941, his Africa Corps drove the British back hundreds of miles, reclaiming lost Axis territory with shocking speed. He outflanked enemy defenses, captured thousands of prisoners, and seized vital supply depots. For a time, Rommel seemed unstoppable. The British, under constant pressure, were forced into retreat. But there was one thing Rommel couldn't control: logistics. And as his forces pushed deeper into enemy territory, the cracks in his supply chain began to show. Unlike the Eastern and Western fronts, North Africa's vast deserts made supply lines dangerously vulnerable. Every tank needed fuel, every soldier needed water, every advance needed reinforcements. But Hitler, obsessed with his invasion of the Soviet Union, refused to prioritize Rommel's needs. The British, using superior naval forces and intelligence, systematically cut off Rommel's supply routes. Soon, the unstoppable Africa Corps found itself starved of fuel, ammunition, and fresh troops. At El Alamein in late 1942, the tide finally turned. The British, under General Bernard Montgomery, mounted a decisive counteroffensive. Outgunned, outnumbered, and with supply lines in tatters, Rommel had no choice but to retreat. And yet his greatest battle was not against the British, but against Hitler himself. The fight for Egypt and the Suez Canal, the Axis gateway to the East, With the Africa Corps reeling from logistical struggles, Rommel still had one objective in sight: Egypt and the Suez Canal. If the Germans could take the canal, it would be a catastrophic blow to the British war effort. The entire Middle East and its vital oil reserves could fall into Axis hands. The war in Africa wasn't just about land. It was about controlling the arteries of global power. And for a moment, it seemed Rommel would succeed. Despite dwindling supplies, Rommel launched an all-out assault on Egypt. His forces pushed toward the key city of El Alamein, where British defenses were thin. If he broke through, the road to Cairo and the Suez Canal would be open. British forces, struggling to contain the assault, feared this could be the moment the Axis turned the war in their favor. But war is a game of endurance, and no matter how brilliant the strategy, without resources, even the strongest army will falter. And then the British launched a counterstrike that changed everything. In October 1942, British General Bernard Montgomery made his move. Reinforced with American supplies and intelligence from cracked German codes, the Allies struck back. Tanks rolled forward, smashing through exhausted German defenses. The Luftwaffe, starved of fuel, could no longer dominate the skies. Rommel, now facing a hopeless battle, pleaded with Hitler to allow a full retreat. Hitler refused, but Rommel was about to make a fateful decision, one that would set him on a collision course with the Führer himself. By mid-1942, the sands of North Africa had become a brutal battleground. The Africa Corps, battered but relentless, stood on the doorstep of Egypt. Victory was within sight. The British were pinned down, struggling to hold their fragile defensive line at El Alamein, a narrow stretch of desert where the Axis advance could be contained. Rommel, sensing weakness, prepared for one final strike. His forces, though exhausted, still had the skill and tactical edge to break through. And if they did, Cairo would be next. But the British had no intention of letting that happen. While Rommel planned his final push, a new British commander took charge, General Bernard Montgomery. Unlike his predecessors, Montgomery refused to be reactive. He knew that time was on his side. He built up an overwhelming force, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Supplies from America flowed into British ranks, tipping the balance. Intelligence teams cracked German radio codes, giving Montgomery an advantage Rommel never saw coming. Rommel was about to walk into a trap, and when the moment came, the desert erupted into chaos. On October 23, 1942, British artillery roared across the desert. For the first time, Rommel's forces weren't dictating the pace of battle. They were on the defensive. Wave after wave of British and Commonwealth troops surged forward, forcing the Germans back. The Luftwaffe, crippled by fuel shortages, could no longer control the skies. German supply lines collapsed, leaving Rommel's tanks stranded, unable to maneuver. The tide had turned. Rommel was outmatched, outgunned, and out of time. But Hitler refused to accept defeat. And for Rommel, defying him could mean something far worse than just losing a battle. With Rommel's retreat from North Africa, the Axis grip on the Mediterranean began to weaken. But the Allies knew that driving the Germans out of Africa was only the beginning. The real battle lay ahead, Fortress Europe. There was no easy way in. France was heavily fortified, and Hitler had turned the coastline into an impenetrable wall of steel and concrete. But Italy was vulnerable. If the Allies could knock Italy out of the war, they could strike at Germany's underbelly, forcing Hitler to fight on yet another front. But Mussolini's Italy was still under German protection, and the invasion would not go unchallenged. On July 9, 1943, the Allies launched Operation Husky, an amphibious invasion of Sicily, a stepping stone to the Italian mainland. 160,000 Allied troops stormed the beaches, backed by one of the largest naval armadas in history. German and Italian forces, though outnumbered, fought fiercely, turning the island into a battlefield of fire and blood. The Axis had one last hope: hold Sicily long enough to evacuate their forces to mainland Italy. For 38 days, the Allies clashed with German tanks, paratroopers, and elite divisions, inching their way through mountains, cities, and fortresses. But despite the resistance, Sicily fell, and with Sicily lost, Italy itself was next. But what happened in Rome would shock the world. The loss of Sicily sent shockwaves through Italy. The people had suffered years of war, shortages, and bombing raids. Now they turned against Mussolini. On July 25, 1943, King Victor Emmanuel III removed Mussolini from power and placed him under arrest. Italy was on the verge of surrendering. The Allies believed the war in Italy would soon be over, but Hitler wasn't about to let Italy fall so easily, and Mussolini's story wasn't over yet. Mussolini's grand vision of a new Roman Empire was crumbling. Italy had failed to hold North Africa, lost Sicily, and now the Allies were at their doorstep. But Mussolini's greatest failure wasn't just losing territory, it was dragging Germany into a war they never wanted to fight. When Italy invaded Greece in 1940, Mussolini expected a quick and glorious victory. Instead, his forces were humiliated and pushed back. Hitler was furious. The Wehrmacht had to intervene, delaying the invasion of the Soviet Union and costing Germany precious time before winter set in. Now with Mussolini overthrown and Italy on the brink of surrender, Hitler had a choice: abandon Italy or pour German resources into saving a lost cause. Hitler made his decision, and it would cost him dearly. Hitler refused to let Italy fall into Allied hands. He ordered German divisions to seize control of the country before the Italian government could surrender. German paratroopers stormed Rome, capturing key positions. The Italian military was torn between fighting alongside the Germans or switching sides. Mussolini, rescued by Nazi commandos, became Hitler's puppet leader in a desperate bid to keep Italy in the war. But the damage was done. Germany was now forced to fight in Italy, draining resources, manpower, and focus from the Eastern Front. And what came next, one of the bloodiest battles of the war, would make Hitler regret ever stepping foot in Italy. As German forces bled across Italy and the Eastern Front, another war raged in the vast expanse of the Atlantic. This was not a war of armies, but of steel wolves lurking beneath the waves. The Battle of the Atlantic was Hitler's desperate attempt to choke off Britain's lifeline, a battle that, if won, could have starved the British war effort into collapse. The wolf packs, U-boats on the hunt. From 1940 to 1942, German U-boats dominated the Atlantic. Convoys carrying vital supplies to Britain were being torn apart by stealthy German submarines. The Kriegsmarine deployed wolfpack tactics, swarming unsuspecting ships in coordinated attacks. British losses were staggering. Thousands of sailors and millions of tons of supplies lost beneath the waves. By early 1942, Hitler's U-boats reached American shores. Merchant ships burned off the coasts of New York and Florida. The United States was caught unprepared. Its cities lit up like beacons for German periscopes. The Allies were losing, but then the tide shifted. Because of an unseen war fought in the shadows. Germany's secret weapon in the Atlantic was the Enigma code. U-boats could coordinate attacks without fear of being intercepted. The Allies had to break it or lose the war. In a hidden facility in England, cryptographers at Bletchley Park raced against time. Using an early computer, Alan Turing cracked Enigma, allowing the Allies to read German naval orders. The hunters became the hunted. Convoys rerouted, U-boats ambushed, and the Kriegsmarine's dominance collapsed. By 1943, Hitler's Wolf packs were no longer predators. They were prey. Germany had lost the Atlantic. But even as the seas fell under Allied control, a new battle raged above, one that would bring the war home to Germany's doorstep. With the Atlantic secured, the Allies turned to a new strategy, breaking Germany's will through relentless bombing. The plan was simple but brutal: burn Hitler's war machine to the ground. Bomber squadrons from Britain and the US launched night-and-day raids over German cities. Key industrial hubs, Essen, Hamburg, Cologne, were reduced to rubble. Civilians faced firestorms unlike anything seen before in warfare. But the most controversial raid was yet to come: the bombing of Dresden, a city of art, history, and civilians. What happened next would spark debate for decades. Was it a military necessity or a war crime? The Battle of the Atlantic, Germany's silent stranglehold. As the fires of war raged across Europe, another battle unfolded beneath the waves, one that could have determined the entire outcome of World War II. This was the Battle of the Atlantic, Hitler's attempt to starve Britain into submission. From the war's earliest days, Germany understood one brutal truth: Britain was an island nation, reliant on the steady flow of supplies, food, weapons, oil, crossing the Atlantic from the United States and Canada. If Germany could sever this lifeline, Britain would crumble. At the heart of Hitler's naval strategy was the Kriegsmarine's deadliest weapon, the U-boat. Unlike the vast surface fleets of Britain or the United States, Germany relied on stealth and precision. Operating in groups called wolf packs, these submarines stalked Allied convoys like predators in the night. By 1941, Britain was losing over 500,000 tons of supplies every month. Entire fleets vanished beneath the Atlantic waves. In some months, more Allied ships were sunk than could be built. Victory for Germany seemed within reach. With every torpedo that found its mark, Britain's position grew more desperate. Fuel shortages began crippling industry. Rationing became even stricter. A quiet fear gripped Churchill's war cabinet. Could Britain hold out much longer? But even as German U-boats dominated the seas, a hidden war was already underway, one that would turn the tide against Hitler's wolf packs. Germany's U-boats weren't just effective, they were unstoppable because of their encrypted communications. The Enigma machine allowed U-boat commanders to coordinate attacks in total secrecy. The Allies were blind, and the Atlantic was turning into a graveyard. But then, something remarkable happened. At a secret British facility called Bletchley Park, a team of code breakers, led by Alan Turing, was racing against time. Their goal? To crack Enigma. After years of failure, Turing's machine finally broke the code in 1941. For the first time, the Allies could read German naval orders in real time. U-boats found themselves ambushed, convoys changed course, and suddenly, the hunters became the hunted. But even with Enigma cracked, the Atlantic battle wasn't over yet. Hitler had one last card to play, one that nearly shattered the Allied advantage. The U-boats had ruled the Atlantic. Allied ships burned, supply lines lay in ruins, and Britain's lifeline to the world was fraying. But in the shadows, an invisible war had been raging, a battle not fought with torpedoes or depth charges, but with logic and mathematics. At Bletchley Park, a team of British code breakers, led by the brilliant but enigmatic Alan Turing, had been working against time to crack the Enigma cipher, the system that shielded Nazi naval communications. Every convoy lost, every U-boat strike, had been orchestrated through encrypted messages that the Allies could not decipher. But then, a breakthrough. In 1941, the British Royal Navy captured a German U-boat, U-559. The mission was suicidal, But what the British sailors retrieved from the sinking vessel was beyond priceless. An intact Enigma machine and the critical code books needed to decipher German communications. Suddenly, the battlefield shifted. Every U-boat order, every attack plan, every route, it was all exposed. Convoys, once easy prey, now changed course before danger arrived. German submarines found themselves ambushed, depth-charged, and hunted like never before. The Kriegsmarine was blinded, and for the first time, the hunters had become the hunted. But even as the Allies seized the upper hand, Hitler was about to unleash a final, desperate gamble in the Atlantic, one that would test their newfound advantage like never before. By 1942, the tides of war were shifting. Germany had stretched itself thin across multiple fronts, but within its borders, its industrial heart was still beating. Factories churned out tanks, planes, and weapons, and the Nazi war machine continued its relentless advance. But the Allies had a plan to change that. The bombing offensive begins. The British Royal Air Force, RAF, and the United States Army Air Forces, USAAF, embarked on one of the most ambitious aerial campaigns in history. Day and night, waves of bombers set out toward German cities, carrying thousands of tons of explosives. By day, American bombers targeted precision locations, factories, oil refineries, and railways, crippling Germany's ability to wage war. By night, British bombers rained destruction over entire cities, aiming to shatter morale and break the enemy's will. One by one, Germany's vital industrial hubs became infernos. In July 1943, the city of Hamburg became the target of Operation Gomorrah, a massive bombing raid. Waves of bombers struck for 7 straight days, and the devastation was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Temperatures reached 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, strong enough to melt steel. Entire neighborhoods disintegrated in minutes. A firestorm, a tornado of flames consumed the city, suffocating thousands as oxygen was pulled from the air. The effect on Germany was profound. Production slowed, supply chains crumbled, and Hitler's military had to divert precious resources to defend against the aerial onslaught. But even as Germany struggled under the weight of destruction, its war machine was not yet broken. However, Hitler had one last card to play, one that would push the Allies to the very brink. The turning point, the collapse of the Nazi war machine. The Allied bombing campaign had crippled German industry, but Hitler was still far from surrender. The Reich was wounded but not defeated. As Germany burned, its army still clung to vast territories in Europe, but the cracks were widening. On every front, the pressure was mounting. The Eastern Front, Stalingrad, the breaking point. By late 1942, the Eastern Front had become a graveyard for the Wehrmacht. Hitler had once envisioned Operation Barbarossa as a swift victory, but now the dream had turned into a nightmare. In Stalingrad, entire German divisions were swallowed by relentless Soviet counterattacks. Trapped and surrounded, the German Sixth Army, once Hitler's pride, was forced to surrender in February 1943. More than 90,000 German soldiers marched into Soviet captivity. Only 5,000 would ever return. This wasn't just a defeat. It was the moment the world saw that Hitler's war machine could be broken. But even as the Eastern Front collapsed, another deadly front was about to erupt. On June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in history stormed the beaches of Normandy. Over 156,000 Allied troops landed across 5 beachheads. The Germans were caught off guard, their defenses overwhelmed. Within weeks, France was liberated, and the Nazi war machine was retreating on all fronts. As the Allies closed in from the west, Stalin's forces surged forward from the east. The Reich was being squeezed, and Hitler's time was running out. But Hitler had one last desperate plan, a gamble that would either reverse his fate or seal Germany's doom. The Reich was crumbling, but Hitler refused to surrender. He still believed in a miracle, one final stroke of fortune that could change everything. But the Allies had other plans, the largest amphibious invasion in history. On June 6, 1944, as the world held its breath, the largest armada ever assembled crossed the English Channel. Over 5,000 ships carried 156,000 troops toward the shores of Normandy. Thousands of aircraft filled the skies, pounding German fortifications. Paratroopers had already landed behind enemy lines, cutting off German reinforcements. Hitler's Atlantic Wall, the supposed impenetrable defense of Fortress Europe, was about to be tested. The bloody battle for the beaches. The landings weren't easy. At Omaha Beach, the water ran red with blood. German machine gunners cut down wave after wave of American troops. Many never even made it to the shore. For hours, the battle hung in the balance. But slowly, the Allies pushed forward. Through gunfire, through chaos, through the very heart of hell. By the end of the day, the beaches of Normandy belonged to the Allies. The tide had turned. With Normandy secured, the Allies surged forward. The German army was on the run. In just 2 months, Paris was liberated. The French resistance rose up, striking German forces from within. Hitler's dream of a 1,000-year Reich was now measured in months. But Hitler wasn't finished. In one final act of desperation, he would launch his last great counterattack. The Battle of the Bulge was about to begin. The beaches had been secured, but the real battle was only beginning. Normandy was a fortress of hedgerows, sniper nests, and artillery traps. The Allies were no longer fighting the sea. They were fighting a determined enemy on unforgiving terrain. The battle for Caen, a city reduced to rubble. The key to breaking out of Normandy was Caen, a vital transport hub. But Hitler had ordered that it be held at all costs. The British and Canadians launched wave after wave of assaults. German SS Panzer divisions fought like cornered animals. By the time the city fell, it was little more than a wasteland of burning ruins. But even with Caen secured, the Allies were still trapped. The Germans had held strong, but now the Allies changed tactics. Instead of a slow grind, they would strike with overwhelming force. Thousands of bombers darkened the skies, turning German positions into smoking craters. American armored divisions, led by General Patton, punched through the enemy lines. What had once been a stalemate became a full-blown collapse. German forces panicked, retreating in chaos. They had one final hope, to regroup in the town of Falaise. The Germans thought they had an escape route. They were wrong. Allied forces encircled them, sealing off their retreat. Tanks, artillery, and airstrikes turned the valley into a death trap. Tens of thousands of German troops were slaughtered, captured, or left to rot in the fields. The German army in France was broken. Now the road to Paris was wide open. With the Allies advancing, the French resistance rose up. They would not wait for liberation, they would fight for it. Street battles erupted as resistance fighters ambushed German patrols. Paris burned with gunfire as the Germans struggled to maintain control. General von Choltitz, Hitler's commander in Paris, was ordered to destroy the city rather than surrender it. But in the end, he refused. On August 25, 1944, the Allies marched into Paris. The City of Light was free, but Hitler was not finished. As the Allies celebrated, he prepared one last desperate counterattack, the Battle of the Bulge. Could the war still turn in Germany's favor? The answer was waiting in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. Paris had been liberated, the Allies were advancing, and for the first time in years, Germany was on the defensive. But in the shadows, Hitler was planning one final, desperate gamble. a strike designed to break the Allies before they could reach Germany. It would be the largest battle the U.S. Army had ever fought, December 16, 1944. Before dawn, the forests of the Ardennes erupted. Thousands of German artillery shells rained down on unsuspecting American positions. Panzer divisions stormed forward, crushing everything in their path. Dense fog covered the battlefield, grounding Allied aircraft and giving the Germans a crucial advantage. The Allies had never expected an attack here. The Ardennes was supposed to be quiet, a place where exhausted soldiers could rest. Instead, they found themselves facing a full-scale German onslaught. As the German forces surged forward, they surrounded the strategic town of Bastogne. Inside, the American 101st Airborne Division was cut off, outgunned, and freezing in the bitter cold. Supplies ran low, ammunition was rationed, the wounded froze in the snow, medics overwhelmed by the sheer number of casualties. German loudspeakers taunted the Americans, demanding their surrender. Then came a message from the German commander: surrender or be annihilated. The American response, one word: nuts. With that defiant answer, Bastogne became a symbol of American resistance. But how long could they hold out? While Bastogne struggled to survive, General George S. Patton was already moving. In just days, he pivoted his entire army north, something military strategists had thought impossible. Marching through ice, snow, and relentless German attacks, his forces pushed forward. On December 26th, the siege of Bastogne was finally broken. The German offensive had stalled. Their fuel supplies were dwindling, their troops exhausted. The last great push of the Nazi war machine had failed, but Hitler wasn't done yet. As the battle ended, a chilling new threat emerged, one that would take the war to its darkest chapter yet: the fall of Berlin. With the Western Front collapsing, how would Hitler prepare for the final battle? The answer would come in the ruins of his once mighty capital. The Battle of the Bulge had drained Germany's last reserves. Hitler had gambled on breaking the Allied front, but he had lost. Now, as the winter of 1945 turned to spring, the Allies stood at the gates of Germany itself. The Rhine, Germany's last natural barrier. The swollen waters of the Rhine River had always been Germany's shield. Hitler believed that if his forces could hold the river, they could buy time, maybe even force a stalemate. Bridges were rigged with explosives. Defensive lines stretched for miles, fortified with artillery and bunkers. Nazi propaganda claimed the Allies would never cross. But the Allies had a secret weapon: speed. Near the town of Remagen, American troops stumbled upon the Ludendorff Bridge, still intact. It was a miracle. The Germans had failed to destroy it in time. American forces stormed the bridge under heavy fire. German engineers frantically tried to detonate the remaining charges. Despite near collapse, the bridge held, and the Allies poured across. This was the first time enemy troops had crossed into Germany's heartland in generations. Hitler was enraged, executing officers who had failed to destroy the bridge. But it was too late. The final push had begun. To break German resistance, one last great airborne operation was launched. Thousands of paratroopers and gliders landed behind enemy lines. Elite German troops fought desperately, knowing surrender meant the end of the Reich. By nightfall, the Rhine defenses had crumbled. Nothing now stood between the Allies and Berlin except a collapsing Nazi war machine. The road to Germany's capital was open, but the Allies faced a dilemma. The Western Allies wanted to advance cautiously, securing key cities. The Soviets, on the other hand, were storming toward Berlin with unmatched speed. Hitler's empire was now under siege from both sides. But deep inside his bunker, the dictator refused to surrender. With the Red Army closing in from the east and the Allies pushing from the west, how long could Nazi Germany hold out? The answer would be written in the streets of Berlin. The end had come. The mighty Third Reich, which had once stretched across Europe, was now reduced to a battered capital, Berlin. As the Red Army closed in, the city braced for its final battle. By April 1945, Soviet artillery pounded Berlin day and night. The city was encircled. There would be no reinforcements, no counteroffensive, only death or surrender. Over 2 million Soviet soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks, crushed German resistance, desperate Nazi units, including Hitler Youth and the remnants of the Waffen-SS, defended the city street by street. Civilians huddled in basements, caught between Soviet fire and Nazi orders, to fight to the last man. As Soviet forces reached the Reichstag, the symbol of Nazi power, the battle turned into a brutal last stand. Beneath the crumbling ruins of Berlin, Hitler refused to face reality. His generals begged him to surrender. He refused. He issued orders to non-existent armies, believing victory was still possible. Paranoia took over. He accused his most loyal officers of betrayal. As the Soviet troops breached the city center, Hitler finally saw the truth. The Reich was finished. On April 30th, Hitler and Eva Braun retreated to their private quarters. Hours later, a gunshot echoed through the bunker. The dictator was dead. His body was carried outside, doused in petrol, and set ablaze. The Nazi leadership collapsed within hours. By May 2nd, the Red Army seized the Reichstag. The swastika was torn down, replaced with the Soviet flag. 1 week later, on May 8th, Germany unconditionally surrendered. The war that had cost millions of lives was finally over. But what if things had been different? How close had Hitler truly come to victory? What moments could have changed the course of history? Berlin was in ruins. The streets that had once echoed with the triumphant marches of Nazi rallies now lay in silence, filled only with the distant rumble of Soviet tanks and the cries of the wounded. The Reich had crumbled, but the final act was yet to be written. The final hours, a government in disarray. With Hitler dead, leadership fell into the hands of Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, a man who understood the inevitable. He attempted to stall, hoping to surrender to the Western Allies while keeping the Soviets at bay. A futile dream. Allied forces continued their advance, sweeping through Germany with unstoppable force. The last pockets of resistance collapsed. Some fought to the death, others deserted. Dönitz sent envoys to negotiate surrender, but the Allies had only one condition: total, unconditional capitulation. As British and American forces pressed in from the west and the Soviets from the east, there was nowhere left to run. In a small schoolhouse in Reims, France, General Alfred Jodl, one of Hitler's last military leaders, sat across from the Allied commanders. His hands trembled as he signed the document that sealed Nazi Germany's fate. The war in Europe was officially over, but only on paper. The Soviets demanded their own ceremony, one that would take place in the heart of Berlin. In the shattered capital, deep within Soviet-occupied territory, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed Germany's unconditional surrender before the watchful eyes of the Red Army. Stalin had what he wanted, a victory written in Berlin itself. It was over. The Third Reich, which had once threatened to dominate Europe, was no more. Allied nations erupted in celebration. VE Day had arrived. But while the guns fell silent in Europe, the war was not yet over. Across the world in the Pacific, another war raged on. Would Japan surrender, or was the world about to witness an even greater horror? For years, the world teetered on the edge of an unthinkable reality: a Nazi-dominated Europe. There were moments when victory for Hitler seemed not just possible, but imminent. The Allies fought desperately, but at several key points, the war could have taken a different turn. The narrow margins of history. What if Britain had fallen? What if the Soviet Union had collapsed in 1941? What if the United States had delayed its entry into the war? These were not just hypothetical questions. These were very real possibilities. In 1940, Germany crushed France in just 6 weeks, shocking the world with its blitzkrieg tactics. Britain stood alone, vulnerable, its army shattered after Dunkirk. If Hitler had launched an immediate invasion, could Britain have held out? In 1941, Operation Barbarossa pushed deep into Soviet territory. Moscow was within reach. Had Germany captured it before winter, could the Soviet Union have recovered? In 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic raged. German U-boats nearly choked off Britain's lifeline. With a few more months of dominance at sea, could Britain have been starved into submission? Each of these moments was a pivot point, a fragile balance where the war could have swung in Hitler's favor. Despite its terrifying momentum, the Nazi war machine was not invincible. Germany stood at the gates of victory more than once, but it was miscalculations, strategic blunders, and Hitler's own decisions that sealed its fate, delaying the invasion of Britain and shifting focus to the Soviet Union, underestimating the resilience of the Soviet Red Army and the brutality of the Russian winter, declaring war on the United States, a move that ensured Germany would face overwhelming industrial might. These errors weren't just minor missteps. They were the turning points that prevented Nazi Germany from achieving total domination. If just one of these decisions had played out differently, would we be telling a different story today? Or was the fall of Nazi Germany always inevitable? By late May 1940, the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, was trapped. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were cornered on the beaches of Dunkirk, facing annihilation. The German army was closing in. Luftwaffe bombers rained destruction from above. The sea behind them was their only escape. But with the Royal Navy stretched thin, evacuation seemed impossible. Had the German advance continued without hesitation, the entire BEF, over 300,000 men, could have been lost. Britain would have been left defenseless. With its army shattered and its military stockpiles exhausted, could Churchill have withstood the pressure to negotiate peace? Some in the British government, including Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax, had already considered seeking terms with Hitler. Without an army to fight back, with no means to repel an invasion, would Churchill's defiance have been enough? Or would Britain have been forced into an uneasy surrender, leaving Nazi Germany unchallenged in Western Europe? But then, the miracle happened. Against all odds, a hastily assembled fleet of civilian boats, warships, and fishing vessels evacuated nearly the entire BEF. Hitler's infamous halt order, his belief that Britain would sue for peace, bought the Allies just enough time. But Dunkirk was only the beginning. Even with its army saved, could Britain really survive the full weight of the Nazi war machine? Or was it just a matter of time before Hitler found a way to break them? By the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone. France had fallen, and across the English Channel, Hitler's forces loomed. But for Germany to invade, one obstacle remained: the Royal Air Force. The Luftwaffe, vastly superior in numbers, launched an all-out aerial assault. Day after day, swarms of German bombers and fighters clashed with British pilots in the skies over England. Radar stations were targeted, airfields bombed. Britain's defenses were pushed to the brink. For a time, victory seemed within Hitler's grasp. If the RAF had collapsed, the Luftwaffe would have gained air superiority, and with the skies clear, the German war machine could have launched its most ambitious operation yet. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. The invasion plan was brutal. Tens of thousands of German troops would storm the beaches of southern England. Paratroopers would land behind enemy lines. The British Home Guard, vastly outnumbered and under-equipped, would have been Britain's last line of defense. But would it have worked? Even if the Luftwaffe had dominated the skies, the Royal Navy remained a formidable force. German landing craft were crude, not built for open sea invasions. And with Britain's superior naval presence, would the invasion fleet have even made it across the Channel? Was Hitler truly on the verge of victory? Or was Operation Sea Lion doomed from the start, an illusion of German invincibility that could never have materialized? By the summer of 1941, Hitler stood at a crossroads. Western Europe was under Nazi control, Britain remained defiant but isolated, and the United States had not yet fully entered the war. Germany had the chance to consolidate its empire, fortify its hold on occupied territories, and direct its full might against Britain. But instead, Hitler made a fateful decision. He turned east. Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in history, shattered the fragile Nazi-Soviet pact and opened a second front. It was an act of ambition, hubris, and perhaps the single greatest mistake of the war. Had Hitler delayed or even abandoned his invasion of the Soviet Union, the consequences could have been staggering. Germany could have redirected its resources toward crushing Britain, strengthening its air force, expanding its navy, and tightening its grip on occupied Europe. With no Eastern Front to drain German manpower and supplies, could Britain have held out indefinitely? Without the Soviet Union absorbing the full weight of Germany's military, Stalin would not have been forced into an alliance with Britain and the United States. And if the Soviet Union had remained neutral, or worse, stayed in a non-aggression pact with Germany, would the Allies have ever been able to land in Europe? But then another question arises. Could Hitler have ever resisted the temptation of the East? Was his obsession with Lebensraum, Germany's expansion into the East, so deeply ingrained in Nazi ideology that avoiding war with the Soviet Union was never truly an option? Or was victory within his grasp only to be squandered by his own impatience? By late 1941, the war had reached a critical stage. Germany had pushed deep into the Soviet Union, Britain stood defiant but weakened, and Japan was expanding rapidly in the Pacific. Europe was a battlefield engulfed in fire, but across the Atlantic, the United States remained officially neutral, watching, waiting. Then everything changed. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. A surprise attack by Japan dragged the United States into war. Days later, Hitler made a decision that defied all strategic logic. He declared war on the United States. It was an unnecessary move, one that turned the war into a global conflict the Nazis could no longer control. Now, the full weight of American industry, manpower, and technology began shifting the tide. Factories that had once produced automobiles now churned out tanks and aircraft. A country that had once hesitated was now fully committed. The sheer scale of American production dwarfed anything Germany could hope to match. But it wasn't just about weapons, it was about timing. Without U.S. involvement, how long could Britain have withstood the relentless attacks? Without the flood of American supplies through the Lend-Lease program, could the Soviet Union have held the Eastern Front? And then came D-Day. On June 6, 1944, American, British, and Canadian forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. It was the largest amphibious invasion in history, a logistical marvel that only a nation with near limitless resources could have pulled off. Without U.S. manpower, air support, and industrial backing, would the Allies have ever launched a successful invasion of Western Europe? But there's another question. What if Hitler had never declared war on the United States? Would Roosevelt have found a way to enter the European theater? Would America have remained focused solely on Japan? Could Germany have held on long enough to force a negotiated peace? In the end, Was it Germany's aggression that doomed its own ambitions? Or was the sheer weight of America's war machine an unstoppable force that made Hitler's defeat inevitable? Nazi Germany's downfall wasn't due to a single mistake. It was a pattern of overconfidence, reckless ambition, and underestimation of its enemies. Hitler believed the Blitzkrieg was unstoppable. It had shattered Poland in weeks, crushed France in a matter of days, and sent Britain reeling. But victories bred arrogance. By 1941, Germany was at the peak of its power. Yet instead of consolidating its gains, it reached too far, too fast. The invasion of the Soviet Union was meant to be swift, a campaign of months, not years. Instead, the vastness of Russia, the resilience of Soviet forces, and the brutal winter turned it into a war of attrition that Germany was never prepared for. By the time Hitler realized his mistake, it was too late. Then came another miscalculation, declaring war on the United States, a decision that handed his enemies near limitless resources and industrial power, ensuring that Germany would be outmatched in both firepower and manpower. Strategic overextension had crippled past empires, the Romans, Napoleon's France, and now Nazi Germany. Instead of learning from history, Hitler repeated the same fatal errors. But there's one final question. Was defeat inevitable, or could a more disciplined Germany have held on to its empire? If Germany had exercised restraint, if Hitler had listened to his generals, could the war have ended differently? Or was it doomed from the moment he set his sights on total domination? Victory in war isn't just about firepower. It's about who can outthink, outproduce, and outlast the enemy. Germany's early success relied on surprise, speed, and ruthless efficiency. But as the war dragged on, a new kind of battle emerged. One fought in the shadows, in factories, and in war rooms. Intelligence played a crucial role. The breaking of the Enigma code by the Allies turned the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic. British and American cryptographers intercepted German plans, giving their forces a crucial advantage. The Nazis believed their communications were unbreakable, an assumption that cost them dearly. Then came industrial power. While Germany relied on rapid victories, the Allies played the long game. The Soviet Union moved its factories east, far from German bombers, producing tanks and weapons at an unimaginable scale. Meanwhile, American industry roared to life, flooding the war effort with planes, ships, and ammunition. For every German tank destroyed, the Allies built 5 more. It was a war of endurance, and Germany couldn't keep up. And finally, alliances. Germany stood largely alone, propping up weaker partners like Italy and Hungary. Meanwhile, the Allies formed a united front. Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States, despite their differences, coordinated strategies, shared intelligence, and reinforced each other's strengths. Germany, on the other hand, was stretched across multiple fronts, with no one to come to its aid. In the end, war isn't just about the battles fought, it's about who can outlast the storm. With superior intelligence, endless production, and a web of alliances, the Allies turned the tide. But did Germany ever have a real chance of overcoming these obstacles? Or was its defeat sealed the moment it faced a world united against it? Victory came at an unfathomable price. By the time the guns fell silent in 1945, the world had changed forever. Over 70 million lives were lost. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. Borders were redrawn. Millions of people, soldiers, civilians, prisoners, were caught in the devastating crossfire of a conflict that had spiraled out of control. The war wasn't just fought on battlefields. It was fought in homes, in factories, in underground bunkers, and in the hearts and minds of those who lived through it. It was a war of ideology, of resources, of strategy, and above all, a war of consequences. For Nazi Germany, its downfall was as much a result of its own mistakes as it was of Allied resistance. Overconfidence, strategic overreach, and ideological arrogance led to miscalculations that cost Hitler his empire. What began as an unstoppable force of conquest ended in ruin, with Hitler dead in his bunker and the Nazi dream in flames. But the world did not simply return to peace. The war's scars remained, shaping the Cold War, redrawing the political map, and leaving behind questions that still haunt us today. Could it have been prevented? Did the world truly learn from the horrors that unfolded? And perhaps the most important question of all, could it happen again? History is filled with warnings. The dangers of unchecked power, the consequences of underestimating an enemy, the fragility of alliances, and the deadly cost of war. These are lessons written in blood, lessons that, if ignored, could doom us to repeat the same cycle. Because in the end, war isn't just about who wins and who loses. It's about what remains after the battle is over. As the world watched Germany fall, the question lingered, was this truly the last great war? Or was it just the beginning of something far more dangerous? A sea of white headstones stretches across Normandy, each a silent testament to the cost of war. The wind moves through the grass, carrying whispers of those who never came home. These were not just soldiers, they were fathers, brothers, sons. Lives cut short in the name of a cause greater than themselves. The ruins of Berlin, once a shattered wasteland, now stand tall as a city reborn. The Reichstag, once draped in Nazi banners, is now a symbol of democracy. Germany, once the instigator of destruction, rebuilt itself from the ashes, forever marked by its past. In Hiroshima, a lone structure remains, the skeletal remains of the A-bomb dome, a permanent reminder of the devastating power humanity had unleashed. Nations swore it would never happen again. But how much control do we truly have over the future? The shot shifts to London. The city that once endured the Blitz now thrives with life, its skyline towering over the River Thames. And yet, beneath the modern glass and steel, the scars remain. The echoes of air raid sirens, the memories of bomb shelters, the stories passed down from those who survived. In Stalingrad, now Volgograd, the Motherland Calls statue looms over the land where one of history's bloodiest battles was fought. The snow covers the battlefield where over 1 million lives were lost. The price of war, frozen in time. As the camera pulls back, we see the grand memorials of the Holocaust, the Auschwitz gates, the silent halls of Yad Vashem. A reminder that beyond the battles and strategies, the greatest crime of all was not just the war, but the genocide that came with it. The final shot, the eternal flame at the tomb of the unknown soldier, burning against the dark night, a symbol of sacrifice, of memory, and of a question that will always remain. Did we truly learn from history? Or will we one day repeat it? As the world honors the fallen, history waits. Will we listen to its warnings? Or will another storm one day rise? The flames of history never truly die. They burn as a warning, a lesson, and a story waiting to be told. We've seen the rise and fall of empires, the cost of ambition, and the devastating consequences of war. But history is not just about the past. It shapes our present and our future. Understanding it is the key to ensuring we never repeat its darkest chapters. If you want to keep exploring these pivotal moments, if you believe history should be remembered and its lessons shared, then join us. Like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more gripping history documentaries. This was just one story. There are many more to tell, and together we will uncover them.